Well, European leaders met in Brussels today for an emergency summit to approve the quota system to deal with the refugee crisis currently facing the continent. The meeting is the culmination of weeks of negotiations, of course, and diplomacy between the members of the EU who have struggled to find a coordinated response to the problem. Well, despite 4 countries voting against the mandatory refugee quota system, the measure was passed by a majority, a rare and provocative move which would see those who refuse to accept the quota suffer penalties. Well, Robert Coniam reports now on what the quota could mean for the future of Europe.
Another day, another line of refugees looking to Europe for help. In Brussels, Europe has responded, albeit for some under duress. The European Union has approved a relocation programme for 120,000 migrants identified as being in clear need of international protection. However, the proposed plan has met with significant resistance. Hungary, Slovakia, Romania and the Czech Republic all voted against the plan, with Finland abstaining and the UK opting to refrain from taking part. Poland initially opposed the plan, however voted in favour, a move that has proved unpopular with many on the right.
Poland disappointed its allies. The Polish government showed not only a white flag, but a befouled white flag. We know that there is no chance to block this decision, so we decided to negotiate the best solution for Poland and Europe. We chose an active attitude to protect our interests, not voting against, which won't bring a positive result.
It's a sentiment that echoes with Slovakia. Prime Minister Robert Fico has said he would rather face punitive measures than accept the diktats of the majority. Slovakia is believed to be in the process of a legal challenge to the relocation programme, with many objecting to a majority ruling in Brussels when it comes to matters of national sovereignty.
We will go in 2 directions. The first one is that Slovakia will file a legal complaint against the mandatory redistribution of refugees on the basis of quotas with the court in Luxembourg. The second one is we will implement these decisions of the Interior Minister because the quotas are meaningless. The system will not work and Slovakia will be forced to adopt quotas.
Another objection raised has been how countries would financially support the influx. President of the European Parliament, Jean-Claude Juncker, has pledged that money will be found, with at least an additional €3 billion being made available.
The Commission has not left any stone unturned to find money in our European budget. We have almost doubled the resources to tackle the refugee crisis from 4.6 billion to 9.5 billion euros.
One source of funding could potentially be the financial punitive measures to be enforced upon reluctant members. A penalty of 0.002% of GDP for those who refuse to accept migrants is thought to be in part of the deal. A move Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has alluded to as moral imperialism. As Europe passes one divisive aid measure, the next challenge facing the European Union is to remain united in the upcoming months. Robert Coniam, Arise News.
For more on this, I'm joined here in the studio by Dorcas Guata, a mental health nurse and news analyst as well. Very good afternoon to you. We're seeing what's happening here in general terms, brought about by the EU, but you can see that to some extent the physical needs of these migrants and refugees, we have to split them like that, I suppose, are being catered for, but not the very, very important psychological needs. How profound an effect is all of this having on people?
David, this crisis has thrown an EU who are already divided, already struggling, into conflict. Greece was already struggling. It's on their knees. Economically, they were already struggling. Hungary doesn't have any concept of diversity at all. So here you've got a flood of people emerging into Europe, and Europe doesn't know what to do itself. When Europe don't know what to do themselves, they do nothing. The mental health impact of this population, who are moving very swiftly, quicker than the policymakers are, is that we can expect to see quite a lot of PTSD over the long term.
Sure.
PTSD itself doesn't manifest itself in the immediate term. So as people assimilate, as they begin to sort of settle, we can anticipate that there may be some depression in there, possible suicides. We've got a lot of other countries that we can contrast to that have other crises. The recent Ebola crisis, we're beginning to pick up pieces, mental health impact of that, from that crisis. So there will be some issues in terms of identity, settling down, complex cultural issues. It's always going to be very difficult to settle down.
And there's such an amazing, a colossal amount of people on the move, 480,000 at the last count. So one would think one could gauge from that the number of people that might suffer from PSD, the number of people that might even commit suicide. We saw that in the Bosnia conflict, people having to resort to that because of the sheer trauma of living with what they'd seen and what they were going through. And
you know, David, the impact of this is that the underlying issue is that Europeans are arguing that they have no money to. Now let's trickle that down to the human level. That means people are more likely to live in poverty right here in Europe. We have this problem as it is going. Here in Britain, I work in the mental health field, and I can tell you that there are people who are living in poverty. A good proportion of that will be migrants because of the issues of, you know, assimilating within the whole population. So the economics around settling down are going to be very problematic. I do anticipate that we've had 3,000 deaths into this crisis, and I anticipate that number is probably bigger than we actually.
Do folk like yourself differentiate between so-called economic migrants, as the authorities seem to, and the, as it were, genuine refugees coming from the likes of Syria? I mean, both can suffer the same thing, can't they?
In humanity terms, David, we're human beings. We will always want better for our children. Wherever we are, we're always going to want more. So in terms of sort of mental health professionalism, we wouldn't define human beings as migrants. We would say patients. Yeah. If you come into my hospital, you're a patient, you're not a migrant. And we treat them. That is the best thing about Britain, is that we treat human beings we treat people as human beings. Underlying issue, which has to be acknowledged here, is that there are a number of children who are traveling alone. And here in Britain, in Kent Social Services has already acknowledged that their social services is overwhelmed by the number of children who are traveling alone. That has huge implications. We know that those children become very vulnerable to sexual exploitation, to trafficking. They are already in the belt of, you know, the trafficking movement. So this kind of sort of dialogue is already there. We've got a catastrophe here in our hands. Europe must get itself together, organized in a way that they can actually meet the needs.
I think it'll take... What kind of master plan could be put together, though? It's so difficult with such an enormous amount of people.
You've got to... I think what we haven't done is sold this idea to our own populations that this is something that we have to do. There are a lot of policymakers that are making a lot of noise. Media, you know, sets its cameras where it needs to set a camera, but we haven't had an everyday dialogue here about what this means at human level, population level, and I think those dialogues need to go through. 10, 20 years' time, we'll begin to see the impact of this.
It's a slow-burning fuse. Yeah.
Rebuilding Syria is going to be very difficult. If half your engineers and 3/4 of your doctors and 3/4 of your nurses have moved out of the country, look at the Zimbabwean context in terms of Africa, rebuilding that is going to be very problematic. So I think the real impact in mental health, social development, economic development is going to take a little while to roll out.
I'll tell you something that was interesting a couple of days ago. I don't know if you read it, the comments from Boris Johnson, MP here in the UK. He was suggesting that what should be done as part of a European master plan was to set up so-called safe havens within Syria itself. And I thought, this could happen. It's now being discussed, obviously. So therefore, the people will be kept in their own area, which obviously would rather reduce the trauma of them having to move out and go elsewhere. Is that some kind of move toward helping?
The problem, David, is that we've now dangled. When Mrs. Merkel said, we will take in as many refugees as possible, everybody packed their bags. And Britain was no longer the country of choice.
Yeah.
In fact, Germany was the country of choice. So people will continue to make that movement. And as far as they will continue to take the risk that they will take. Yes, we can take those, we can strengthen those camps, which is very much David Cameron's move, that we actually do something about Syria. I don't think it'll stop particularly the journeys and the floodgates that we're seeing coming into Europe.